Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Mindful in Minutes podcast. I'm Kelly, and today we have a guest. We are joined by Cassie once again. So you were first introduced to her on this podcast. I know a lot of you were already familiar with her work before then, back in 2022 when she shared a guest practice with us. And now Cassie is back to talk about grief. This is something that a lot of you have been asking me to talk about, and I just didn't feel like I had the tools in my toolbox to do this conversation justice. And so Cassie popped into my mind the other day, and I was like, I don't know why I didn't think of her sooner. So she's here to chat with us. And if you are new to Cassie, she is a mother, an artist, a death and energy worker, and a rites of passage guide. She's the author and illustrator of 7 books and 2 card decks. You've heard me talk about these on the podcast before. I adore her work. And her work is trauma-informed and rooted in earth-based animalist spiritual practices from her ancestral roots across Northern Europe and her local environment. And with over a decade of magical and intuitive mentoring and training and 25 years of practice, she is passionate about helping folks feel spiritually supported in all seasons of life, including death. And that's what we're going to be talking about today: death, dying, and grief. So Cassie, with all of that, welcome back to Mindful in Minutes.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for asking me. And I'm really happy to talk about this topic because it's so needed. It's part of our human experience. And I think we're really grief starved in our society. And so it's something, not only do I like to talk about it, but I like to bring a little bit of lightness to it and playfulness to it, that it doesn't always have to be sobbing and heaving on the floor.
I am so glad you're here to talk about it because we were chatting a little bit off mic, and I don't want to forget, but I want to come back to this idea of grief starved in a moment because that really intrigues me. And some of the listeners know, but I recently had a loss in my family that I've been grieving, and it was one that just didn't feel right. It was actually someone that, it's not my story to share, but what I will say is we actually became closer through this podcast, which is really interesting. It was a family member that, like, when we were younger, we weren't as close. But then as she was moving through her battle with cancer, she really turned to meditation, and she started listening to this podcast, and it really had us reconnect over the last few years. And it was so interesting to have kind of that shared experience and to reconnect over something that we both loved. And she would just text me and be like, oh, I loved, the meditation. I love the imagery you used on this week's meditation. And we would just chat, and I don't know. And so it just felt right to talk about it because this podcast was also something that was important and special to our relationship, but also to her. And it's something that you and I both know, that how much just turning inward and meditation and these different practices can be so supportive for us in any season of life. And so after her passing, about maybe a month, maybe when this comes out, maybe about 2 months ago, so still pretty new, but after her passing, and I was sitting with my own grief, and I was like, what do I do with this? And then that's when you popped into my mind, because I was like, why haven't I thought of Cassie? This is what she does. She knows what to do with this. And so I thought that we could have this conversation together. And I love how you bring lightness to it, because I think I am still in the heavy sadness stage of grief. And I think that's what we default to. And so I, for personal reasons, am also excited to hear about how you can bring a little bit of lightness to this. And I'm so curious about the work that you do, because I think that I often get stuck in that heaviness. Even in my family members, last few days, she asked me to come to be with her in hospice and do kind of a just a little practice and things like that. And I'm by no means, a death doula like you are, but it was just something that we did. And I'd never really been in hospice. I guess I had, but it was for very old grandparents. I before we hit record, I said, this one just didn't feel right, because it was she's younger than me, and it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel like the natural order of things. And so I'm curious, because when you initially said that we are grief starved, I was like, are we grief starved, or am I like so grief full? I don't know. I'm not starving for grief. Can you tell me more about like this term and what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I would just like to name, it feels like doing this podcast, having this conversation is in a little bit a way to honor this loss for you and to honor her. It feels a little bit like a legacy piece to to honor her life. So I just want to name that because I'm really touched by that your podcast brought that connection, and that we're here talking about that connection today. So it feels really apt. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. Oh, see, already I'm feeling bad. I knew you were the person to talk about when people are like, what do I do with grief? I'm like, I don't know what to do with grief, but already, I'm feeling better.
So the grief starved, it's not necessarily that there's not enough to grieve. Like, we have ample amounts in this world, in our communities, in our personal lives to grieve. There's so much to grieve. But when I say that we're grief starved, it's that we have lost the ability to be with our grief. And it's something that's so innate. I would say it's something that's like eating or birthing or bleeding. These are processes that are innate in our being. But because we live in a society that is so focused on the external, the outward, that is so terrified to talk about death, dying, and grief, that the methods and the modes that we have to process and be with our grief, that is where I feel that we are starved, and there is a disconnect from something, like I said, that is so natural within us. Death is so natural. And to be with that death, to grieve death, is such a natural part of being a human. But when we don't have examples of how to do that, it leaves us hungry for ways to honor something that's innate and natural in us.
That makes so much sense. And I'm so curious because when you had announced, I think it was even a couple of years ago, because I just love all the work that you're doing, your podcast, everything. But when you announced that you were doing work to become a death doula, I think that was a couple years ago, I was so intrigued by what that was. I was in, pork chop. My son wasn't that old. And so I had recently given birth. I was familiar with the concept of like a doula. And I had never even heard this term before. And it like just opened up something in me. I was like, what is that? And I was so curious about this work that you're doing. One, the actual like logistics of it. I'd love to hear about the nuances of what you actually do in work in death, dying, and grief. But also, I think my first question is, how do you do that? And I know that you're talking about it's such a natural process, but I imagine that you are sensitive in the way that, we've been working together on and off for a few years. And so I imagine you're sensitive. I know you're very intuitive in many of the ways that I am also sensitive. And how do you do that work and not take it on and not feel the heaviness of it, even if it is a natural process? But I also feel the same way about even like labor and delivery nurses. I'm like, how do you do work in such intensity and such high charged emotional states day in and day out? And so I'm curious about that. And then I'd also love to hear about like, what is it that you do? Like, talk me through your job, I guess, or your calling in death and dying and grief.
Yeah. I think I'll start with how it looks, which is different for every person that I interact with. I sit with people virtually, I sit with people in real life, and also the death work is it's a piece of my work. especially where I'm at in the world, which is in a very conservative, I live in so-called Indiana. It's very conservative. A lot of people are like, excuse me, you're what? So a lot of the work that I'm doing in the death field is volunteer work, but I do it for pay as well. And I do it online and work with clients. So it's an evolving piece of my work. And I would say like how it works for me is totally different. Just like a birth doula, everybody has their own skill sets, what they bring to the table. So what I share about how I work with death as a death doula may vary vastly from somebody else. But what I've noticed for me and the people that I work with is so much of it is bearing witness and being with whatever is present. Deep active listening is a really big part of my work because, and you might have, and your listeners, if they have any experience with hospice, and bless hospice workers, we need them, but their work is in the physical. Mm-hmm. And this is a process that requires subtlety, nuance, slowness, intuition. And again, so this is an area where there's a yearning, there's a starving that's happening where we don't have this. So I come in and I offer that slowness, that nuance, that subtlety. So if I come into somebody's space who is in their death journey, and I might ask them a few questions and I could sense, oh, you actually don't want to talk today because the pain in your body is so intense that all you can do is be with your body. And so in a situation like that, I might say, do you want me to just sit with you and hold your hand and bear witness and be with you in this process? And so that might be. A lot of it is nonverbal. And I've worked with people who are in a nonverbal state before too. So that's where the intuition comes in for me. I had a really beautiful experience one time with somebody who had late stage Alzheimer's, and so they were completely nonverbal. But we had this communication that happened very organically, very intuitively. And there was a day where they had somehow gotten their socks off. They weren't able to move a lot either, but they got their socks off and just presented me with their bare foot. And I thought, oh, you want your foot massaged? Of course, I'm happy to massage your foot. And it's if I'm not in a place of deep awareness, deep presence, or have the spaciousness to be with that moment would just pass by or may not be seen. Because I am so intuitive, there is, I am able to communicate on a certain level with people who are nonverbal. Which is something that's unique to the way I show up in my death work. Now, when I work with people who are grieving, that's a totally different situation. But again, the deep active listening and the slowness is a big part of it. I'm saying, what do you want to share about this death process that you just witnessed and were a part of? What's alive in you that you haven't been able to speak to or name? And sometimes that takes a lot of building rapport and a sense of safety for those things to even be spoken. Because again, we live in a society where we're taught that we need to get through it. We need to push it to the side. We need to get back to productivity, that there's not time to speak to or feel the things that need to be spoken to and felt. And so much of my work with people with grieving is creating that soft place for what needs to be said and what needs to be felt to come out. And then sometimes I get to weave in ritual. That's a big part on both ends. In the death process, there's the vigil, which is where somebody's actively dying, and we can bring in scents, we can bring in candles. Hopefully these are conversations that maybe happened before. If somebody has lost somebody and they're grieving, again, this is a beautiful place to bring in ritual. Are there ways that we can honor this and bring some physicality to this loss in a way that can help you metabolize and process it in a different way. And I'll speak briefly to the energy of it, which I love this question because it is, and I would say it is my energy work practice, my understanding of energy that allows me to be, to work in this space, because it is a lot to hold. It is a lot to be with. And so for me, that looks like a deepening and a widening of my connection to the earth. It is not just me holding this. It is my connection to the earth. It is my connection to my ancestors. It is my connection to my guides, to the plant allies that I work with. So it is a collaborative process. It is not just me holding and tending to these sacred spaces.
Thank you for explaining all of that. And how do people, I have so many questions from those questions, or from that answer, because there's so much in there that I think is interesting. And this, I think all of my questions just speak to this idea, like you said at the beginning of our conversation, like grief starved in a way. It's like we aren't talking about these things. We don't talk about death and dying. And do you think the reason we don't talk about it is because it's like socially unacceptable? I'm sure there's a component, at least in my heart, like I don't talk about it, grief. And also I think a lot about like when my mom had breast cancer and she, beat that battle, but there was a time where I didn't know if she would. And so it was like, I was already grieving a potential loss. Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's hard to talk about. And so I imagine there's a piece of that, but what do you think is outside of, it's hard to talk about this stuff because it's so emotionally charged. It's sad. It's heavy. What's like the deeper thing that stops us from talking about this or having these conversations?
That's a big can of worms, Kelly.
Okay.
And also it's a can of worms that people are going to have a different perspective on.
Sure.
I think that the erasure and the intentional suppression of the feminine and the matriarchal ways. And I say this with not in a way that I'm like, men are bad, men are evil. It's not that black and white, but there is a fact. We can look back into antiquity and see that once mothers and women were at the center. And we can see that in artifacts like the Venus of Willendorf, who is this beautiful, full-figured goddess. And in seeing that and naming that, we can look at the world today and see how hyper-focused we are on production, on the external, on not aging, or this facade of not aging. And we can see that there's a balance that is a little bit off. I have this drum behind me, and I know that the people listening can't see it, but it shows the phases of the moon. And the phase that's at the top of my drum here is the dark moon. It is the moon hidden. And when I think of death work, I think of the dark moon. And these are the elements of the feminine that have been the most buried, the most suppressed, the most vilified. And I think sexuality is a part of that. I think death and dying is a part of that. I think like this archetype of like the wild woman is a part of that. The crone is a part of that. All of these parts of the feminine that have been suppressed are a part of that. And so with that suppression, we have an imbalance today. And so that's a very short, condensed answer for a very long, something that we could literally talk about for hours. And that's just my viewpoint. And I also want to add on to that death work is not work that is solely for women. I do think it is work, at least in my ancestral lineage. It was often women who sat bedside, but I am of the belief that non-binary people, trans people, even men, like anybody can do this work. And I think that those people have done this work throughout antiquity. But the essence of what's buried is this deeply feminine aspect.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm not afraid to open a can of worms here.
Yeah.
I feel like even our whole conversation, again, because we don't talk about these things, people may see this episode and be like, and feel like we're opening a can of worms. But so much of what you said, I think, is incredibly interesting. And this is also my opportunity to invite everyone to keep what resonates and release what doesn't. I think anytime you're listening to two people have a conversation, it's like some things will land and some things maybe it doesn't resonate with you as much, and that's totally fine. But when you're talking about like this feminine and you're saying that anyone can do this work, I also think that it's important to highlight that anyone can also receive this work.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you were talking, what I was thinking about too in terms of like death and the feminine is I think about my role, but also I think about like my mother's role. And one of my biggest fears when I thought my mom was going to die is she is still in a way the emotional glue of the family, or like the emotional foundation in a way of the family. And now I've taken that on for my family. And I think when we talk about things, I mean, loss, fear, death, dying, grief, all of that, we have people in our families or in our communities. And often, from my experience, they're women or have feminine energy that we lean on, that we rely on for those things. And what I've seen in my own life is that, often the men in my life or in my community, when these hard things come up, it's like they run from it. And so I think it's important too to highlight that not only can anyone do this work, but that everyone needs this work and can benefit from this and work. And like they say, the patriarchy hurts everyone.
Absolutely.
It's not just, it hurts everyone, men included. And remembering that having sort of that stillness, that soft quality, creating space for these things, that's not just something that women or those who resonate with feminine energy can do. It's really for anyone. And it makes me feel sad at times to see men in my community who are really, as you said, grief starved, to go back to that, and maybe not supporting themselves or asking for help or doing the things that they potentially could do in this very kind of slow, tricky process of loss, of grief, of even fear, right? That you might lose someone or something really big and hard pops up in life. Like, what do you do with that? And that's something that I think about often too, being what I can, at times being that emotional glue for my family, just like my mom kind of was for that family. And I imagine most people listening can think of at least one family or community figure where you're like, oh, they're kind of the glue. They're the one that, like everyone else, if something's wrong in your life, who's the first person you call? Like, who's that person for you? And my mom is that for my family. And often now for my kind of nuclear family, it's me. And so I think about that too. So I'm not afraid to open up a can of worms.
Good. And I appreciate you for bringing that in, because I do think, I think for men, it's almost a harder journey because of what's placed on them societally, to not be emotional, to not feel soft. That's they have a long, hard journey to work through to get to that space where it's safe to grieve. So it's absolutely, it affects all of us. So thank you for bringing that in.
Yeah. And I think to have the strength to not have to do it alone, that's something that I've just seen in my life is this. I think that at times women can be better at leaning on one another, or sometimes working collaboratively, especially like in an emotional space. I remember someone once told me, a physician once told me, one of the reasons that they think women outlive men is because there's several different factors. One is that women tend to be better at preventative healthcare. So all my men listening out there, if you haven't gotten a physical, if you haven't seen the doctor, maybe you should do that. But they also had a theory that one of the reasons that women tend to outlive men is because they are more collaborative and tend to have a better sense of community. And so she was using the example of like, think about your grandparents or any older couple that you know. Grandpa or whoever, like his social calendar was usually through grandma or whoever, if it's, just I guess in any couple, you usually have the one that tends to be a little bit more social and maybe their friends come in and become a part of your social circle. But then if they lose that tie to community, to family, to the one that was always saying, come on, let's go out there or let's get coffee with this person, let's do that thing, that then they tend to, and usually it's more men that then tend to self-isolate and they lose those ties to communities versus women, if they are to lose their spouse, for example, in a heterosexual relationship, a lot of times they have other women around them that kind of rally around and, help to pick up the pieces and come over and visit and do all these things. And they think that that's one of the reasons why women tend to outlive men at times is because of those collaborative social ties that they have a tendency to have. And so that's always stuck with me because that is so important. We need that to survive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm curious what called you to do this work? Like, was there a moment, was there something when you were, because I've been following along with your work for quite a while. We've worked together like with, energy work, energy healing. And I'm also, a fan of your books and things like that. But was there a moment, because I remember at least when you announced this and I was like, oh, this is like a new thing that you're doing, a shift. What called you to this work?
Yeah. So it was the death of my grandmother that called me to this work. And that happened, oh gosh, probably like 3 or 4 years before I had actually found, like, because that's what it was. After my grandma died, or during her death process, she died from cancer, and I was able to spend a lot of time with her in her final days. I realized in that experience that death was something I was able to be with very comfortably. I was able to watch my family sort of go into fight or flight, freeze. And I was the one who was able to sit with my grandma and be with my grandma and talk to her and listen to her without an agenda of, this is what you need to do. This is what we need to do. Are you going to do this? Are you going to take this medication? Like, everybody had an agenda. And it was in that experience that I was like, I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing, because it just came so naturally to me. And I was just so grateful to be that person for my grandma. And then 4 weeks later, my dad died suddenly of a heart attack. And that was a totally different experience because it was out of nowhere. It was sudden. And that experience, I was a mess. And what I realized on that side of the spectrum was that there was no support. We had no support. All we had was the funerary system, which just kind of, it's so fast, it's so abrupt. There's all this money changing hands and like you have to make all these decisions. And we were all like in a total daze. And I thought, wow, how amazing would it have been to be able to call somebody who was really like skilled and well-versed in this field to be a solid, grounded force. And then I think at that point I was kind of like, well, maybe I need to go back to nursing school. Like, I just didn't know. And then it was a couple of years later that I heard the term death doula. And I was immediately like, oh, that's what I am supposed to do. There it is. And I did a lot of research and I found INELDA, which is the International End of Life Doula Association. And I did a training with them. They're really great. I highly recommend them. They're very accessible, accommodating, really great program. They do in-person and online trainings. And yeah, so after that, I'm in.
I appreciate you sharing those two very different experiences that you had with loss, because I do think that every experience is going to be unique.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of when people have been asking, like, talk about grief, talk about, after loss, things like that. And I think part of the reason why I didn't feel equipped is because I know it's such a unique experience to everyone's, even doing like guided practices. And a little spoiler alert, like on Sunday, when you're listening to this, Cassie is going to share a practice with us, a guided practice, but I've never done like a guided meditation for grief because I just felt like, how can you truly do it justice when I know it's such a unique experience, not only to the individual, but to the loss that you're grieving or to the experience that you're grieving. It can be very different from person to person and each experience. And so I appreciate you highlighting that.
Mm-hmm.
And then taking it a step further. So after you decided that you wanted to be a death doula and you take the training and all of that, then what's the next step? Do you I know you're out in Indiana. I know you shared it on socials and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
How does one then go out there? And I can relate a lot to what you're talking about because like 10-ish years ago, when I moved to rural Missouri, and I was like one of the only yoga teachers there, and I ended up opening a yoga studio. It was very conservative, a very different climate than what I was used to. I was doing a kids class one time, and I couldn't read this book, Peaceful Piggy Meditation, because they were, the word meditation, the parents felt like was against their religious beliefs. They didn't want me to, influence their anyways. So where I'm going with all of that is then here you are, and now you're living in Indiana. You're a death doula, which, as you said, is a new concept to a lot of people. Do you go to hospitals? Then what do you do?
I mean, that's a great question that I'm still navigating. I feel like I'm definitely like out in the wilderness with my machete, like forging my own trail, 100%. Now, if I were still in Arizona, if I lived in California, New York, like I feel like I would have people knocking down the door being like, yes, sign me up. It is not like that in Indiana. People are like, excuse me, you're what? What are you doing? And then add to it that I'm like, I don't know. It's kind of clear to tell that I'm like a witchy pagan. Like you can just like look at me. I've got tattoos. People are like, okay, this lady has got some different energy going on than what is normally presented here in Indiana. And so, yeah, a lot of it is me putting myself in places. So for a couple years, I ran a local death cafe, which is a place for people to just talk about death. I volunteer at hospice, and I've actually transitioned out of that. And now I'm in the process of getting my CNA training, which is a certified nurse assistant, because in my experience volunteering in hospice, it became clear to me that I would really like to have more of the hands-on physical training to be able to assist in a more holistic way. And so it is really about me like enmeshing myself into where, people are dying right now. And that right now is in hospice. And so, and also like I talk about it. Like if people are like, what do you do? Of all the many things that I do, I like to bring up that one because that one is the one that people are like, ooh, tell me more about that. So I just talk about it a lot. Yeah. And I love opportunities like this to get to talk about it too. I mean, like I said, I do offer this work virtually, but it's, in person is ideal, but I have had virtual clients in this work. So it is possible, especially if you're somewhere in the world where it's not like you do not have death doulas around, which is certainly a possibility in a lot of places. So yeah, I'm still figuring out, forging my own trail. And I can see this vision of myself as Crone Cassie, just like being the local death doula, and everybody knows who I am and everybody knows who to go to. And I feel like that's the trail that I'm mapping right now, is death doula Crone Cassie in her element.
I am loving this image that you're painting, not only of you, with your machete, forging your own path. I love that, but also Crone Cassie. I recently got back from a retreat I was leading in Scotland, and it was like the Wild and Wondrous Woman retreat. And we did there's a point to all this that I'm saying. it's about the crone that came up a lot, because something I've been doing is womb work and womb clearings, and soul baby work is something that I've just personally been doing. And so on this particular retreat, we did a workshop and we did like a womb journey and a womb clearing and all of that. And because we were in Scotland, I was talking about like Bridget and, these different things that were coming in, because I'm only slightly dabbling. I'm like in the kindergarten level where I know you're, have more advanced knowledge in all of this, but like kindergarten level of like connecting with my own ancestral roots and goddesses and things like that. I've just really just been enjoying that connection. In one of our sessions, actually, you were talking about the Morgan, which I was like, oh, that's so interesting. And it always stuck with me and kind of piqued my interest. But anyways, we were talking about how, before we did the journey, we were talking about this archetype of the trifold, like the goddess, right? That can come in these three different forms. And we talked specifically about, and I was like, I feel like the one that always gets the bad rap between maiden, mother, crone. I'm like, the crone always gets such a bad rap, but like, it's such an important part. And so maybe before, in a moment when we shift gears, I have some questions for you specifically about like grief and what you can do with all of that. But would you mind speaking to the idea of the crone a little bit, and why it's so important, and even kind of this journey of like, maiden, mother, crone? Because I don't know, this word crone keeps, even with my son, he was saying something, he's talking about a show he watched, and in it, one of the characters, it shows like an aging sequence or something, and he loves to act out these things. And he said, oh, Mom, you're whoever. And then she turned into an old grandma. And I kind of joked and I said, yep, that's me, just the old crone, as kind of this joke. And he's 4, so now he's held on to it. So even in my own household, it's like this concept of like the crone keeps popping up, but it always gets such a bad rap.
Well, not in my house. We revere and honor the crone in my house, which I would, I mean, she is an archetype that I think is for these times. And then, coming back to this imagery of like the dark moon and the moon cycle, that is where the crone sits. The crone sits at the dark moon. So of course she's been vilified. Of course she's been buried. And that's why we have such a, so many, I shouldn't say everybody, a lot of people have this disdain of looking like they're aging. And I personally am somebody who's like, oh, like I am proud of my gray hairs. Like every new gray hair that comes in, I'm like, yes. Every new wrinkle, I'm like, yes, these are signs of the wisdom that I carry. And I think a lot of times when we look back, and I'm always hesitant to say like when we look back, because I think the medicine that I feel we need right now is like looking to the past, but saying, how do we need to be with this today? Like, we're not trying to go back to that time, but there are pieces of the past that we sure as hell need today. And one of them is the crone and the reverence of the crone. But crones tribally were once revered and honored, men and women. And crone is generally the term given to a female. But I think for the male, it might be Senax. You'll have to double check on that. But in some of the circles I run in, we've talked about that. And I think that that's the term for the wise old man. But yeah, this is another part that's been buried, but it used to be honored, as these are the wisdom carriers. They carry, especially in cultures that were passed things on orally, they literally carried the wisdom of those people. And I think even today, that's one of the things that I hold so dear about the work that I get to do, is that I get to sit at the feet of our elderly today. And they have wisdom too. And to sit with them and to hear their stories, it helps me get in touch with that remembrance that our elders carry so much. And it is an honor to sit with them and learn from them. And again, it comes back to this fast-paced attention economics. Like, it can be hard to carve out space for that, when you're used to looking at TikToks or Instagrams. Like, we're going to have to slow the pace way down.
Yes.
Yeah.
And for that particular reason, I actually took TikTok off of my phone. I've talked a lot about it on this podcast, not only for what it does for my attention span, but I've also been feeling that pull to like just slow it down and like just have a little bit of a pause button. But I appreciate you kind of explaining a little bit more about the crone and, what she stands for. And I think often, and really this recent loss that I had of someone who was younger than me, and I'm still young. I'm only in, my 30s, and someone who's even younger than me, and I think about the gift and the blessing of aging, and like there's people who haven't even made it to 34. And I have, or thinking about like what a beautiful gift. I have a grandpa that's still here. Grandpa Kenny's 95. And it's always so funny because it's like, you ask him like, what's the secret? And it's like, he eats like ice cream and pie every day and like, does everything wrong. And yet he's 95 and just living his life and, having a good time doing it. But I think too, like what a blessing that like aging is a sign of like another even day of like the gift of life that is here that others don't get to experience, don't get to make it that far.
Yeah.
But we do. And I think about that too, kind of that gratitude piece of like what aging means. It means that I've been given a gift of more time.
Yeah.
And not everyone's given that gift. And so to switch gears just a little bit, I have some questions for you specifically around grief. And these are ones that I've heard from my community, but then also some that I just wonder myself. And one of the big ones is I hear from a lot of my listeners that when they're grieving, they feel lost. It's this idea of just feeling lost. Like, I don't know what to do. And it seems like when we're grieving, it's just like kind of this what now? And maybe the answer is that there isn't an answer, but I'm curious if you have thoughts as to when you're feeling like, what now? What do I do? I feel so lost in this grief. Like, is there anything you can do to kind of put one foot in front of the other? Do we just sit with it? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll share something that my therapist, after my grandma and my dad died in that short period of time, I was working with a therapist who dealt with grief. And the most important thing that she taught me in that time that I share with anybody who is grieving is that doing nothing is doing something. Because again, I think that the gut instinct, because of our culture, because of the overculture that we live in, is what do I do? How do I get through it? How do I get out of this? When so often there is like grief is going to take its own time. And for her to give me that pass, which is what it felt like her giving me like here's a pass, like you actually don't have to do anything. And so what I started doing when I was deep, deep, deep in my grief and I did not know what to do, I would pause and check in with my body, which can be hard. Like sometimes even that can be hard, I want to say. And I would just be like, what feels like the most supportive thing for me to do? And a lot of times it was to sit on the couch and watch TV and eat some food. That was what I needed. I literally needed to do nothing. And so I think that reminder of just being like, what are like the bare bones necessities, like to take care of your grieving body, that when you're in the thick of it, for me is like the medicine that's needed. Just rest, just be, eat nourishing foods, put on clothes that make you feel good. Whatever you can do to take care of your body. And with that, I also want to just name the privilege of being able to do that, because not everybody is going to have the accessibility to just do nothing. It's a pass, and also it's a privilege. What a privilege to be able to grieve and take care of your grieving body with such care and tenderness. And so I think that's twofold. It can really give those who are in the thick of their grief journey a little bit of a different perspective that it is truly a privilege to be able to just do nothing and not be forced to have to go back to work. And then on the other side of that, for those, because so many places of work, you get little to no bereavement time, to understand that if you feel lost, that is not your fault. That is the overculture, that we don't have time to grieve built into our society, and to be so, so tender with yourself. And that when you do get those pockets of time, to allow yourself to just rest and be. And, I think there are stages. We hear about the stages of grief. They're not linear. They're cyclical. They're going to come and go. And I'm not going to get into all of them because there are beautiful books written about them. But I think, there's an edge of like, am I quarantining myself off and resting and doing nothing? And it's gotten to a point where I am depressed. For me, that was when I was like, I need to reach out to a therapist. And that's what I did. And maybe for somebody else, that'll be reaching out to a trusted friend, a beloved, a therapist, a death doula who works specifically with grief. But knowing and listening, when is that point where you do need to reach out? And then there are other things that we can do to be with that grief and honor that grief. But I like to start there with rest, take care of your body. But there are beautiful things, like I said, there can be playfulness in grief. And I can't remember who said this. There's a quote, but I think it's a universal thing. So I don't think I need to attribute it to somebody, but basically grief is love. Like I see grief as my love for something. If I'm grieving something, it's because I have such a deep love for it. And love is beautiful. Love is playful. So how would your love for that person, that animal, whatever it is that you're grieving, what is a way that you could express it and breathe life to it? Maybe that's creating a painting. Maybe that's writing a story. So this is kind of getting into that idea of legacy. Like, how are we honoring this grief? And so I think there's something really magical about bringing something physical, whether, like I said, story, writing, gathering pictures, but being playful with it and not rushing it. It's not like, oh, I have to make this legacy piece to get over my grief. It's like, no, can we be with it really playfully and let it take on a life of its own so that you can have this playful, creative outlet to honor your grief and whatever it is that or whoever it is that you're grieving. And so I think that those are some ways, but I really highlight that need for rest because that's the piece that's really left out. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so for those people who maybe don't have the privilege of being able to rest or take that time, I think, there's so many different reasons why you may not have that privilege. I think even like I know a lot of my listeners are moms, like you and I both are, but moms of like little kids, right? Like maybe you don't feel like you can rest because there's a baby that's depending on you,
Mm-hmm.
or, maybe you need to go back to work for financial reasons. There's so many reasons why you may not be able to, and I appreciate you calling out that privilege because it is. For anyone listening who is listening to us talk and be like, okay, great, thanks, Cassie and Kelly, but like that doesn't apply to me. What would you say to those people, or is there any guidance you can give them for even like one sort of tactile thing, not in a productivity, not in a I'm going to get through this way, but if, let's say, rest, being gentle with yourself, slowing down, what if that's not an option?
Yeah. I'm going to say something that's going to probably sound unappealing. I say that because it's something that I've had to get better at myself. And you're going to probably want to ask for help and be really honest with anybody in your circle who is willing to listen. And I know how uncomfortable that can be because, again, it's this this rugged individualism has really been massaged into us, into this generation. I would like to say that it's slowly moving away, but it can be hard to ask for help. But I don't think grieving can happen in isolation. I mean, I know I said to rest, but that's probably going to require, even if people, like, I know for me, when I was deep in it, I had a lot of conversations with my partner. I didn't have children at the time, but I had a lot of conversations with my partner, and I was running a small business, and I had a team where I just had to say, look, like, I can't do A, B, and C anymore. Like, I just can't. And it can be difficult. So if you're in that position, I would say be really honest with yourself and creative about who you can ask for help, and just say, I need this time. Can you pick up groceries for me? Can you watch my kid? Even if it's just an hour, to give yourself that time to decompress and process. Because the grief isn't going to go away. It's going to stay there. And I think anybody listening can probably call somebody to mind who's living their life holding on to a lot of grief that's not been processed, and what that does to a person. So it's not going to go away. And I think, it requires, and when you do that, the beauty of that is you are literally, that is ancestral work that you are doing. When you're saying, no, this is not okay. I have to have this space to tend to myself, to tend to my grieving body. I am going to break the cycle of not asking for help. And I'm going to ask anybody and everybody who will listen to me and help me. I'm going to ask for help, and I'm going to advocate for myself. That's some deep ancestral work that you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's so helpful. And on the flip side, something, what I'm about to say is really this is a very real thing that I'm about to say, but something that I did recently. So on the flip side of, let's say you may not necessarily be the one actively grieving, or I think about, my family member that I lost. She had family members that are much closer, right? Her mother, her partner, people who are, and there can be these different levels of grief, right? And so someone who over the last few years that I became closer to and kind of had this shared relationship with, it's not like, she was my partner or my child or anything like that. But I recently had a friend who's having a really hard time. Her partner is, going through something, and I went to visit and to help support. This is the part that's just a very real, honest thing. So I went to Chat GPT. You probably didn't think this is where I was going with this, Cassie, but I had this plan of like how I could help. And I was thinking, I would do the kind of things that like you could do for someone early postpartum, right? They're going through something medically. It's like, we can meal prep, we can, do this, do that. And I typed out my plan into Chat GPT, and I said, can you tell me, are there any blind spots or anything that I'm missing that could be incredibly helpful for my friend and her partner in this situation? And actually the thing that Chat GPT told me like changed my life, which is kind of wild. But it taught me this thing, and it said, try this technique it was called like, would it be helpful if? And the reason that I want to share this is for anyone who, and we could probably think of people like you said, either people who have grief that haven't been processed, or there's people where even if you're grieving, there may be people that are like really in the thick of it, or you're going to support people in their grief, because all of this is also cyclical too. There'll be times when, if you're lucky enough to have a big, full, long life, there will be times when you are grieving. There will also be times where someone close to you is the one that's hurting and grieving, and you can be there to help support them too. And so what Chat GPT told me, and I've been implementing this ever since, is this, would it be helpful if? And it said, basically, and this resonated with me as a mom with, the mental load is so real. But think about one particular thing. So it's not just about, I'm thinking of you, I'm sorry for your loss. As my friend, I have a friend who calls them T's and P's, thoughts and prayers, sending all the T's and P's or whatever. Think of one specific thing that you could do and be so specific and ask them, for example, would it be helpful if this weekend I stopped by with lasagna, because you know they like lasagna, and popped it in your freezer and you can cook it when you're ready? And having one really specific, would it be helpful if, or for example, would it be helpful if when I pick up pork chop from preschool, I pick up so-and-so too? Do you want to text the school and let them know, would it be helpful if I picked up the boys today? Whatever it is. And have one really specific thing that isn't just, hey, let me know if you want me to bring a home cooked meal sometime. Hey, let me know if, because I think sometimes when you're in the thick of it, when you're grieving, not only is it, as you said, so hard to ask for help, but it's also like the last thing you want to think about is like, what do I need? Who can help me with it? And it's so important to feel comfortable asking for that help. And if you're on the other side of it and you know someone who may be needing some help, doing the would it be helpful if has really changed the way that I've kind of showed up to help support people and say, would it be helpful if I came over and brought you coffee and just kept you company tomorrow afternoon? And do one really specific thing that might be helpful. And then ball's in their court and they can say yes or no. And there's no strings attached to any of that. But I just wanted to highlight that as well. If you know someone who's going through stuff, at least for me, courtesy of ChatGPT, which I don't utilize often, but it felt like the right move this time. And I don't know, it really helped and changed the way that I try to show up to help support people too. So I wanted to share that. And then one other question that I had about grief is, one, do you think it ever goes away? And two, in your experience, if it doesn't go away, what is the evolution of grief look like in your experience?
Yeah. I don't think it goes away. At least in my experience. It changes. When I think about the grief that I carry of losing my grandmother and my father, it shows up differently now. And sometimes it shows up in ways where like I'm hit with a wave of sadness. But more and more as I move linearly away from that, I get hit with waves of, wow, like my dad would be so happy to see where my life is, or I'll just, think about him when I'm doing something. And I still honor him and my grandmother in different ways. And so I think that my grief, it just shows up differently. I think it is always there. I know this is a little bit, let me know if you want me to do this, but I just came across this poem today and it's really short. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'd love to read like these 6 lines of this poem because it felt so apt for our discussion.
Please.
Okay. It says, grief does not fade in the way a life does. Instead, it folds into the fabric of ordinary days. Their face, their warmth and presence, gone now, and yet, in some soft, impossible way, their love remains. And that's by Rachel Elena Faulkner.
Oh,
yeah. I just thought that was perfect for today.
It is. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's like the perfect way to end is with that. And so, Cassie, can you tell everyone how they can work with you, all the different ways that they can work with you? Because it's not just the death doula work that you do. And of course, you're going to be leading our guided practice on Sunday as well. But let everyone know how they can work with you, how they can connect with you and engage with what you're doing.
Yeah. The best place to find me is on my website, which is just Cassie Ewell, and it's UHL for Ewell.com. I would say all my work really weaves together. Like I do the rites of passage work, the energy work, the death work, but they all sort of intertwine and intermesh because I think, like we've talked about, grief is it really touches all parts of our lives. So it works through all of my work. I'm not doing the social media right now, which has been a joy, but I do send newsletters. So if you visit my website, that's the best way to sort of stay up to date and see what I'm into, is either my blog or by joining my newsletter. Yeah.
Amazing. And I'm going to link to all of that information in the show notes. And yeah, and I just want to not only thank you, Cassie, for your time and for sharing all this wisdom, but also just call out like how amazing I personally think your work is, your books, your decks, your podcast, all of this. I'm going to link to everything. I love it. And I'm so grateful that you were here and that we were able to have this conversation. And thanks for sharing your wisdom with all of us.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I'm really happy that we got to have this conversation because I think it's so important. So thank you for your braveness and bringing this conversation here.
Thank you so much.